Welcome and good evening. My name is Michelle Ritter, and I am part of Mercer Island Parent Edge. And Mercer Island Parent Edge is part of the Mercer Island PTA Council. We are made up of parent volunteers from a variety of schools, and we're very glad that you took time out of your evening to join us for this program on navigating microaggressions with Rosetta Lee. As I mentioned in the previous program, Rosetta was planning to join us last spring, and then a snowstorm hit and schools canceled. And then COVID hit and the world changed. And so we are so glad that she had time in her schedule to be with us today to talk about these important topics. Our organization, as I mentioned, is made up of parent volunteers, and I wanted to thank all those individuals for helping us make tonight's program possible. And we would also like to thank KCLS and Friends of the Mercer Island Library for partnering with us on this program tonight. We do have two other individuals I would like to introduce who will be assisting us with the program this evening. Thank you to Lori Cohen-Sanford, who is a Mercer Island Parent Edge member, and to Carrie Bowman, who is a KCLS staff member. And Carrie will be helping us with the Q&A, so you'll see her later. We wanted to let you know that we are recording the webinar tonight, so that if you want to share with others, or for those who weren't able to join us tonight, that you will be able to share. We'll send an email to all of the registered participants in the next few days. We do have some programs that we wanted to share with you. Coming up, we have November 19th, Youth Suicide Prevention for Parents. We offer this program twice a year. It is a program that we feel should be for all parents to have these skills in your toolbox when you need to be there for a student in crisis, whether it's your child or a friend's child. It's really a great program, and we highly encourage you to attend. And this year it will be offered via webinar, so we hope we will get a great turnout on November 19th. And then the same program is on April 20th if the November program doesn't work with your schedule. We are also working on a virtual parent education series where we will offer a variety of topics with local experts speaking on those topics. And parents will also have the opportunity to connect with other parents. We know that we all need as much support as we can get right now. And so you can look forward to some more information about those programs coming soon. And for tonight's presentation, navigating microaggressions. In our previous program today with Rosetta, she talked a little bit about microaggressions, and we're going to dig a little deeper tonight. For those of you who had the opportunity to join us earlier today, you know that Rosetta has a great way of really sharing these challenging topics to help us all see it from a different lens and to really reflect on how we can make those changes in our life and have more positive outcomes. So we are very excited to have her and have her share her wealth of knowledge. Rosetta is a highly regarded local and national expert in diversity, inclusion, and equity. She is a faculty member at Seattle Girls School. She teaches science, math, technology, art, ethics, and social justice. And for over 10 years, Rosetta has been a diversity speaker and trainer on a variety of topics, including cross-cultural communication, identity and gender and sexual diversity, and has worked with over 175 K through 12 public and independent schools throughout the country, as well as a number of colleges and universities. We did have Rosetta join us 2 years ago, and we all really enjoyed her program, and we're very excited to have you back again and get to hear you for another hour. So welcome, Rosetta. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I know it is evening time, and that from the chat, I'm hearing that there are families who are multitasking, listening, and having dinner at the same time. It's wonderful to have you. Those of you who have come back, thank you especially. I know it's been an especially long Zoom day. Before I begin, a few logistical things. One, I am putting into the chat a link to the slideshow that I'm using, so you don't need to worry about taking screenshots or taking down bullet points. I invite you to actually click on the link so that it opens up on a new window, so that while we're in breakout conversations, that you are able to refer to slides, and then you can also revisit them later. The other thing that I'm going to do is put into, oops, sorry, that was a private chat. put into the chat a document summarizing some of the takeaways from this workshop because I go fast and I want you to be able to revisit some of these ideas and maybe share with others. I don't, I'm unable to chat, but there are folks from Mercer Island Parent Edge who will keep an eye out on the chat for me. So feel free to use that as a space to dialogue with one another as well as pose some questions. If you want to pose a private question, an anonymous question, then we have Lori. Yeah, you're on. Yeah. Um, no, Carrie. I keep on thinking Lori's doing the questions. Carrie, and she's like renamed herself Q&A Carrie. So feel free to private chat her, and then she'll elevate the question in the larger space. And then again, from the chat conversations, I understand that some of you are actually like quarantining with multiple adults and or you're watching as a family. And so you'd like to discuss as a group, family group. Feel free when I do make breakout groups, which I just randomize, feel free to just not go into the breakout group and just chat amongst yourselves. You don't feel the need to like join the breakout group when the invitation happens. Okay, dokie. All right, so let's get this party started. I am going to share a screen. Hopefully you are seeing a title slide at this point. So this is a session on navigating microaggressions, and I am from Seattle Girls School, and it's so great to not only be presenting on Zoom so I can be at home, but this, the Seattle area is my home as well. Um, and I just wanted to name that though we're going to be talking about microaggressions, we're dealing with some really complex realities, situations that we're not managing well because we are having a hard time as a country and a culture talking across difference. All of these topics have strong feelings and opinions and divides. And for me, this is a time when courageous conversations are critical. And as much as I think there are communities that desire to have courageous conversations, what I find interesting is often I get invited to do trainings on courageous conversations, and then I get asked to provide training so that folks feel comfortable that maybe I can provide a handbook, maybe a script. And I'm like, that's not the way courage works, right? If I see that somebody has the vocabulary, knows exactly what to say, and they execute it beautifully, I admire them for being skilled, but I actually don't admire them for courage. The folks who are like, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right or if I know all the vocabulary. I don't know how this conversation is going to go, but I see that silence is not helping anything. So I want to try, I want to engage. And those are the folks that I admire for courage. So, though I'll be giving you some ideas around how you might have conversations around microaggressions, I hope you don't take it as a prescriptive thing that you can predict the outcomes for, but rather giving you a springboard from which you can engage in courageous conversations. The other thing that I want to name is navigating microaggressions and other courageous conversations can be especially difficult in today's society because there are a lot of myths that operate in our society that get in the way. So when it comes to talking about identity, diversity, oppression, stereotypes, etc., there's this all or none myth that somehow you either get it or you don't, you're with it or you're not, you're inclusive or you're a bigot. And so when those are the binaries, a lot of folks are nervous about engaging because they don't want to mess up and be marked as one of the people who don't get it. There are genuine and well-intentioned folks who have legitimate questions, but they're afraid to ask because they don't want to be labeled as somebody who is, one of the not get it folks, or those of us who have done a little work feel like we're done and that it's especially difficult for us to acknowledge when we've messed up, right? And then the other myth that gets in the way is we equate mistakes around identity and difference like they're moral failings. And I see this happen a lot, especially in social media, where somebody will say or do something that is offensive to a group of people, and half of social media will rise up to call them terrible names about their overall moral character, which I think is fundamentally unfair. And then the other half of social media media rises up to defend their good personness, right? They're like, this is a nice person, this is a kind person, they give to good causes and they help puppies. And I'm like, that's great. And what they said was not okay, right? So it's that idea of how do we not equate, especially those mistakes that come from lack of knowledge or lack of exposure, as somehow a moral failing. The other thing we are taught to do is don't apologize if you didn't intend it. Oftentimes, microaggressions are unintended, but they have real impacts. And in those moments of learning, oftentimes folks go into a place of, but I didn't mean it, or that was not my intention. And it is really important that we learn to address the impact. Um, the example that I used last session was this idea of we already know what to do if we have cause unintended harm, because we know what to do when we cause unintended physical harm. Because if I'm driving down the street and I accidentally and completely unintentionally run over your foot, as a good person, I'm going to jump out and go, I am so sorry. You must be in so much pain. Let me get you to the hospital. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Um, I wouldn't come out of the car and say, that was completely and totally unintentional. And that is not what I meant to do. And I really don't think you should be hurt. Like, do you have to grab your foot and roll around like that? I think you're being a little sensitive, blowing things out of proportion, right? And it's like you're calling me a bad driver and you don't know me. You don't know my driving history. I'm an excellent driver, okay? And I have nothing against pedestrians. I love pedestrians. Some of my best friends are pedestrians. Like, I'm married to a pedestrian, okay? It sounds a little silly, but that's the way conversations sometimes go, okay? And folks have pushed me on this, like, you can't compare somebody being offended with physical injury, but I have to, because that's what the neuroscience says. Neuroscience tells us that physical pain and psychological pain registers in the same areas of the brain and to the same degree. I've seen an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging of somebody who has been overtly socially excluded and somebody who has been punched in the face, and it basically looks the same. So just like we know what to do when we cause unintended physical harm, we do need to be able to do things like own and apologize when we cause unintended interpersonal harm. The other myth that gets in the way is the tonsils theory, and I'm totally borrowing this from Jay Smooth, who's a hip hop DJ, a video blogger, and an activist. And he talks about how US mainstream culture treats bias and prejudice like they're tonsils. You either have them or you don't, and you can get them removed. So you have a lot of folks walking around saying, oh, I had my bias removed years ago. They don't affect me anymore. I took some cultural competency workshops. I watched Crash. I'm done. Right. And he talks about actually bias and prejudice are more like plaque. There's so much in our history, our systems, our media that's reinforcing and reteaching us misinformation about one another every day, that really what we're trying to do is learn to brush and floss on a regular basis so it doesn't build up and show up in ugly ways. And know this, you can brush and floss beautifully every single day, but it still means every once in a while you're going to have bad breath. And every once in a while, you're going to have something stuck in your teeth. So when we make these mistakes, how do we treat it like somebody just pointed out we had some spinach in our teeth? It's a little embarrassing, but our job is to fix it, not to get defensive about it, right? The final piece is this. The courageous conversations require us to be vulnerable in ways that we say things like, this is really important to me and I want to share it with you. Or this is the way I feel, or I messed up, or I don't know, or can you help me? Or I'm sorry. Like, all of those things are pretty vulnerable moves. And US mainstream culture equates vulnerability with weakness. And the problem with that is, this is from the work of Brene Brown, who has been studying vulnerability and shame. She talks about how vulnerability is the birthplace to courage. Like, she interviewed hundreds of people on their greatest moments of courage, whether it was soldiers on the battlefield or somebody who had to start up a venture, a business from scratch with nothing, or somebody who had a major setback and then needed to pick up and dust themselves off and keep on going. When she asked people about their greatest moments of courage, they always talk about two shared factors, one which is risk and one which is vulnerability. And she talks about how vulnerability is the birthplace to everything important, like learning, right? I don't know it right now, and I'm going to suck at it for a while, but I'm going to try and I'm going to practice until I master it and learn it, is actually a pretty vulnerable act. this notion of creativity or innovation. It literally does not exist, but I want to dream it up and make it come into reality, is a vulnerable act. A true love, telling somebody I love you first, is really vulnerable. Having children, you give birth to this like perfect being, and then you send them out into a world where you don't know what's going to happen. That's actually really vulnerable. So the reality is, those are also the keys to some of the most wonderful things in life. So it turns out when you shut yourself off from vulnerability, you also miss out on some of the best things in life. So I invite you to think about the fact that mistakes, and I'm not talking about like overt acts of intentional like bias and bigotry. I am talking about those honest mistakes that we all make. Inevitably, we need to recognize that they are an important part of a learning process. So this is William Taylor's reflective competence model, and though it relates to anything we want to get proficient at, I think it's especially true about diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence. So often we start from a place of unconscious incompetence. Like, I don't know that I don't know. Okay. We say and do things not because we are bad people with bad intentions, but because we never learned anything better. And I'll give you a personal example. Up until about 6 years ago, I used to say things like this pretty frequently. I used to say things like, oh my gosh, there is so much going on right now. I feel so schizophrenic. Or this sad thing happened and now I'm all depressed, right? Or my mood has been kind of up and down. Talk about a bipolar kind of day. Or I'm OCD about my office supplies. Or, it just feels like it's one of those days where I forgot to take my meds. Or I'm so upset I could kill myself. Okay. Are you hearing patterns in my speech, right? Now, was I doing this because I was getting up every morning thinking I can't wait to minimize mental health and mental illness? No, of course not, right? I picked it up. I picked it up from idioms around me. I picked it up from an overall society that minimizes mental health and mental illness. I picked it up from the fact that I didn't really have authentic relationships with people who struggled with mental health. And so I didn't know that I didn't know. And William Taylor says there's a moment of discovery, which makes it sound super pleasant, but it actually means I got called out. Okay. I had somebody say, you use this language a lot. And I have to tell you, words like schizophrenia and bipolar to me mean things like trying to find the right medication and the right dosage to help me get through the day without changing my personality altogether. It means hoping that people I'm in relationships with don't find this out and like break up with me or stop being friends with me. It means hoping that my boss doesn't fire me because of this. It means hoping that my therapist doesn't deem me unfit for regular society and institutionalize me. These are really big deal words. And for you to use them so casually is so hurtful. And that was so hard to hear because that is not who I am and that is not what I meant. And I could see that I was contributing to an overall environment where this person was feeling this way. And so I did have that aha, and I did like feel that like moment of that is not a good thing for me to do. That is not who I am, and that's not how I want to impact others. But here's the thing, that awareness is actually just the beginning, and it doesn't mean everything improves. Oftentimes, the next stage is conscious incompetence. Like, now we know that we don't know. Okay. And so I'm still messing up, but I'm starting to pick up on the fact that it is a problem and that I mess up a lot. Okay. I like to call this the Homer Simpsons phase of cultural competence because you know what's happening. Folks are like, how are you doing? I'm like, there's so much going on right now. I feel so schizophrenic. Oh, wait, no, I don't. No, I don't. Ah, I learned this. Why do I keep on doing this? Right. Honestly, because I haven't done anything about it. All I have is awareness. Okay. So I can feel discouraged. Like, is this ever going to change? But at some point, I'm like, you know what? I'm better than this. I'm more verbally facile than this. I can express myself without relying on hurtful language. So with learning and effort, I can get to that place of conscious competence where I know what I know. And so these are the days where I'm doing better. But it still takes a level of slowing down and making different decisions, right? This is that stage where somebody might be like, did you see the new movie that came out? I mean, one minute I was laughing and the next minute I was in tears. I'm like, I know, right? Talk about an emotional roller coaster of a movie, right? So I'm doing better, but it takes a level of slowing down and making different choices because without that intention, I can easily slip into my old habits. But if I practice that often enough, it can become unconscious competence where what I know becomes second nature. So these days, I actually don't use mental health terms for describing anything except for the conditions or telling the story, right? And it's not effortful. I don't even think about it anymore. It's just a part of my new way of being, right? But I don't stop there because those are just words. As somebody who deeply cares about how my words and actions impact others, I was saying this for years without even thinking about it. So clearly, I need to do more learning around how do folks experience the world and what are those barriers that exist for folks who struggle with mental health, and what can I do to be a better advocate and ally. And all I know is, as I went on this journey, people who used to draw away from me because I was using this language started to come back, or people who like enter communities that I'm part of, um, like who worry about, this is a part of my reality, and will I be welcome here? Can I belong here? Am I safe here? With my vocal championing and my intervening when others engage in that behavior, like they feel a little bit safer, and they feel a little bit like they can be who they are. And for me, that's like worth all of this effort every single time. So just I highlight this because don't kick yourself for where you are. Just work on moving to the next stage, right? I think about cultural competence like, not are you there yet, but are you moving? Because there's no way we're going to learn everything about everybody, and there's no book that you can read to like avoid microaggressions altogether. All we can do is recognize where we are and commit to improvement. Okay. Now, speaking of microaggressions, this is a term that was developed in the 1970s to disaggregate between things like systemic levels of inequity. So, whether it's like laws that treat people differently or decide who gets to live where and those kind of things. So, like overt and larger systemic bias, right? Whether it's around race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, etc. And psychologists wanted to name the phenomena that happens sort of attitudinally and also in everyday life, not in these like big systemic ways, hence the micro. And they were trying to describe the fact that these acts, though they might not be as overt or as sort of like visible and in your face, they still have psychological impact because there's an accumulation of the impact that happens. Okay. And it's not about the size of the event, it's about the frequency and the pervasiveness and the regularity of the event. I always say all of us know what accumulated impact feels like, because if you've taken a road trip with little kids, you know what accumulated impact feels like. Because the first few times they're like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? You're like, no, baby, we got 8 more hours to go. And about the 60th time, they're like, are we there yet? You want to chuck them out the window. Okay. And that is not because they are awful kids. It's not because you're an awful adult. It's because we have a hard time experiencing the same things over and over again. And so here's the nature of microaggressions. I find that a lot of them are actually unintended, or even based on like implicit bias. So, like, the reality is, as somebody who presents in many different communities, I easily meet like 20,000 people a year. And I know intellectually, all folks are doing is just trying to express a little bit of curiosity and making small talk. But this is a conversation that I have over and over again. Folks are like, so Rosetta, where are you from? And I'm like, well, I'm from Seattle, Washington. And they're like, no, like, where are you originally from? I'm like, I grew up in Boston. And they're like, no, originally, like, where are you really from? And I'm like, I was born in Korea. And they go, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Except it doesn't, right? Because there's nothing in my vocabulary, my language, my mannerism, my accent, my clothing, my way of being that says I just got here. But this is a question that I get for like 4 to 10 times a month. And there are days when I'm feeling generous and patient and I'm feeling educational. I've had my morning coffee. And they're like, really, originally, where are you from? And I'm like, well, I think the question you're actually trying to ask is, what's your ethnic heritage? Well, that's Korean, but I'm actually a US citizen from Seattle, right? But that's on a good day. That's on a good day. I'm not going to pretend that I can do that every day, because there are days when I'm not at my best, or I don't feel like educating others, or it's already happened too many times. Like went to a meet and greet event where literally 7 conversations in a row went, where are you from? No, really, originally, oh, Korea, I love kimchi. And they moved on, right? So the eighth person that comes up, I'm done with this conversation. And so they're like, no, originally, where are you really from? And I'm like, really, originally, I'm from my mother's womb. And you? Right. And that's not because I'm an angry or hypersensitive person. It's because I'm tired. Right. And there are many microaggressions that happen in communities. And so, for example, African Americans are often told, you are so articulate, or their hair is touched without permission. Latinx folks are often asked, how did you arrive in the United States? Or like, say this in Spanish, right? Multiracial folks are asked, like, what are you? Right? Women and girls are told, you play football and use power tools. Like older folks are complimented. Oh my gosh, you can use an Apple Watch and an iPad. Good for you, right? Folks are like, well, you don't look Jewish, right? Um, folks say things like, oh, you're too pretty to be lesbian. They say things like to adoptive parents, like, have your kids met their real parents yet? Okay. If you listen to the intention, there's actually nothing hostile about any of those things. There's often a desire to connect, express curiosity, compliment. But if it happens to the same community over and over again, eventually a different subtextual message gets across, right? Because when it's me and people who look like me who are the only ones asked, like, where are you really from? And folks are waiting for another country, I start to hear, where are you really from? Because people like you aren't actually Americans. That's what I hear, right? African Americans hear, you're so articulate and I didn't expect you to be, right? Or your body boundaries don't count. So I just want to touch your hair because I'm curious, right? Um, Latinx folks basically hear there must be some sort of dramatic, possibly illicit means by which you came to the United States, and that somehow you automatically speak Spanish, even though if somebody says I have French heritage, we wouldn't automatically demand that they say something in French, right? This is where like multiracial folks here, I can't go on with this conversation until I know what box to check for you, right? Women and girls here, you are the weaker sex, and yet look at you do these powerful things. Older folks here, isn't there like an age at which you can't learn new technology? Good for you, you managed, right? Like, Jewish folks basically here, even though it's like a religion and spirituality for many, it automatically has some sort of ethnic or racial look to it, right? Um, or that lesbians basically here, like, isn't sexual orientation a choice you make because you can't get a date with a member of the opposite sex? Like, you're so pretty, what happened, right? Adoptive parents here, you may love your kids and you may lay down your life for your kids, but you're not an actual parent, real parent, unless you got blood connections. Like, none of this is what we mean, and all of this is what gets heard. So for me, it's that idea of reducing microaggressions in a community. Let folks know that they belong and that their identities are valued, and that this is a community that will not impact them over and over again with overall societal stereotypes, right? Um, and so at this point, what I want to do is give you an opportunity. Actually, I should have I'm going to share the slideshow again. At this point, I want to give you an opportunity to go into breakout groups. And I have a couple of questions. One, what are those microaggressions you'd like to interrupt in your everyday life and community? Just because when we go into the tools for navigating microaggressions, it sure is nice to have specific examples that we might like think about applying some of these skills to, right? And then what are the barriers for you in terms of navigating microaggressions, interrupting microaggressions? Is it like the all or none, or this idea of mistakes feel like a moral failing? So those are the conversations I would love for you to have. So I'm going to stop sharing and then put you into breakout rooms. And then let's see. Again, if you are in a pod or a cohort or a family and you'd like to converse amongst yourselves, you don't need to join the group. You can just like mute and have a chat. Okay. I'm going to give it 10 minutes for this round. So I invite you to have a chat on those things. In the chat, I'm going to put in the slideshow again in case you joined later. Oh, sorry, in case you join later and don't have access to the slideshow. Okay, see you in 10. All right. Looks like all the rooms are closed and everyone's back. This is an opportunity for us to have a chat. You're welcome to put in reactions, comments, questions in the chat, or raise your hand or ask to be called on so we can unmute you and you can share some of your thoughts in person as well. Up to you. And again, anonymous questions go to Q&A Carrie. Awesome. I know it's one of the minuses of Zoom where I can't like rotate and eavesdrop on multiple breakouts. Right here. You like talking to each other more than me? That's fine. It happens.
Rosetta,
yes.
In our breakout room, we had a lot of people say that the question, which they acknowledged was probably just more curiosity, but one person noted that it had when it was always the first question about where they were from. Yeah. And we're curious. I would love to know sort of your feedback on how someone might turn that around or respond.
Yeah, and for me, like this is not about like, you know, I hope we don't go to that all or none place where it's like, can you tell me all of the things that I can say and the things I should never say? I'm like, I think that's actually one of the ways that the all or none gets in the way of authentic connections. It's not that I don't want people to ask where I'm from. It's just when I say Seattle, I want you to believe me. Right? Or that like an Asian person doesn't feel like that's the only or the first question that will always come up. But I think it's always important to be like curious, right? And so it, you know, because the reality is, I think there are times when folks are like, you know, I'm from Taiwan and let me tell you about Taiwan. It's so beautiful. And I, you know, love that place. And like anybody who lets me talk about Taiwan, I can talk about it for hours. So there's no like shake and bake formula, right? So a lot of these answers are going to be like, there's no clear-cut answer. It's really about like going forward with the best of intentions and dealing with the impact, whatever it may be, not necessarily looking for the cure-all that will always have the positive impact, because that's not the way interacting across difference works.
I have one for you, Rosetta. How can we overcome the fear of saying something wrong?
One of my favorite ways to overcome the fear of saying something wrong is say out loud, I'm worried that I'm going to say something wrong. Because I think about how, you know, one of my identities of privilege is being a cisgender person. I was assigned girl at birth, and that's the way I identify. So I navigate the world pretty easily. And I'm so like, not like morbidly curious, but like I want to know how to be better and more supportive of gender fluid and gender non-binary and transgender people, right? And so I'm doing some of my learning, but sometimes that's not enough, right? And so there are times when I'm like, you know, I really worry that I'm going to offend you or that you think I'm asking you to represent your people. But you know, the reality is like I'm reading some articles that say it's important to have everyone introduce gender pronouns at the beginning of any gathering to let folks know who are non-binary and transgender, like you are welcome here and you get to claim your identity. And I'm reading in other places that you should never do that because it forces people to out themselves in communities where they don't know whether they're safe or not. And I'm like in this like place of confusion and paralysis, and not that you have to represent your people, but I'm just curious, like how does that feel to you when like there are pronouns at the beginning of like a meeting or something, right? And at the end of the day, if they don't want to answer it, I'm okay with that too, right? But for me, it's that idea of sometimes naming a thing actually lets you overcome it.
Rosetta, can you see the chat? Or Carrie, do you want to read that? I don't know if Rosetta can see, but that question.
Yeah, there are a couple things in the chat I want to share.
Yes.
One is someone says, our group talked about the statute of limitations for confronting someone about microaggressions. How do you confront something in the past now that we are more aware?
Well, I think about how long a past are we talking about, right? I think it's one thing to like, okay, so one of the things that I think about is there is a changing of the times, right? And so I think about how even like a little over a decade, it was pretty commonplace for people to say Oriental, right? but it's not okay anymore, right? And so for me, if it happened yesterday and it made me feel a way about it, I'm going to go back to have that conversation with that person, right? But if it happened 20 years ago, I understand that it was a different context. So
I'm going to continue if I can. Also, in Mercer Island, people introduce themselves as third generation Mercer Islanders with pride. But with our redlining history and lack of access to generational wealth, how do we point out to people that this is not promoting inclusion?
Yeah, and here's the thing, like I think about the difference between saying, saying third generation Mercer Islander is like saying I was the beneficiary of redlining. That's one way to go, right? It's factual and it's one way to go, but I'm not sure that it's gonna have the sort of like impact that you're looking for. But I wonder what it sounds like if I'm like, I can't wait when people can say I'm a third generation Mercer Islander and we have communities that are working class, community immigrant communities, and communities of color. I'm really excited for that new Mercer Island.
Oh, nice. Thank you. That's nice. Another one, I think about conversations I've had with friends who have adopted children. I want them to know I'm interested in their adoption story, but don't want to say the wrong thing that would make them think their parenting role is different than mine. How can we be curious without causing harm?
Yeah, and again, it's that idea of um for me, like I here's what I find. The people who are really worried about like saying something wrong are rarely the ones who say something wrong.
Right.
I'll be honest with you. It's most of the people who think like I'm down with the funky beat or this is a totally okay question to ask that I'm like, oh, right. But again, like, one of the things that I talked about last workshop is this concept of stereotype threat. And what happens is when you're like concerned about being a stereotypical example, there's a part of you that's worried about that, even at a subconscious level, that you underperform. And so this is why, like in standardized testing, for example, like if you have girls fill out like those bubbles that declare gender right before they take a math test, it'll actually like affect their scores because you remind them that they're a girl and there are stereotypes about girls not doing as well in math, right? And it happens with like a lot of things, like for example, like people of color who are like, I so don't want to come across as that angry person of color. And then when I get passionate, it's almost like I become extra sort of like passionate and almost like aggressive looking, right? This is why my mother, who has a thick accent and has limited English proficiency, even though she knows so much about like medical conditions because she was the primary caretaker for my dad, I have to go to doctor's appointments with her because she's like, when the doctors look at me in that belittling way, I can't remember the words, right? And it also shows up in privilege identity groups that really want to do the right thing. So, as an able bodied person who really wants to be like really inclusive and sensitive to people with disabilities, I noticed that in my earlier life, I was super awkward with people with disabilities, right? Like I work with the profoundly deaf man and eventually we became friends. But when we first started working together, like within 2 weeks, he like confronted me and said, why don't you like me? And I'm like, what are you talking about? I think you're great. He's like, I lip read and I watch you interact with everyone else and you like have casual chats and you hang out and you ask about themselves and things like that. With me, it's usually because you need something or like, you need to tell me something. And then after that, you're gone. Like, why don't you like me? And I realized that the place I was coming from was I didn't want to be one of those obnoxious hearing people who spoke louder to deaf people. Like somehow if I'm louder, you'll all of a sudden be able to hear, right? I didn't want to do things like over enunciate everything and insult somebody who has been thriving as a lip reader for most of his life. I didn't want to use like simplistic words or use big gestures and insult his intelligence. I didn't want to do any of those things that would offend. So I was subtly avoiding him altogether. Right. Um, and this shows up in the research around white people as well, is that Claude Seal actually had white participants engage in conversations cross-racially. And the people who did the worst were actually the folks who were like, I don't want to say it or do anything that might offend or come across as somebody who's like racially biased. Like in cross-racial situations, the people who are the most worried about that showed less warmth in the face. They had more awkward and stuttering speech. They put more physical distance between themselves and people of color, which basically looks like a white person who doesn't want to interact with people of color, right? And so here's the thing is that for me, I think the fear of doing the wrong thing, making us not engage, sometimes actually comes across like we didn't notice or we don't care. So I wonder what it looks like to be like, I honor your motherhood just like my motherhood, but I'm sure that there are things that we share in common and things that are different. And I'm curious about that. And I hope that at some point, if you're willing, I'd love to talk to you about it sometime, right? Because until we sort of like, if we're waiting for that perfect moment to introduce that topic, in the meantime, it may be that she thinks about it all the time and would love to have somebody to talk with and talk along with, like even just getting the perspective of like, how is the situation? Am I experiencing this because I'm an adoptive parent, or is this just like a parent thing, right? Because there are times when, let's face it, especially in the teenage years, there are a lot of parents who are like, is it me? Is this happening just to me, or is it like everybody, right?
Rosetta.
Yes.
Hi, Kimberly. Frank. Thank you. Oh, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
okay, and then Robin Lee after that, please.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. I'm wondering, in our group, we talked about a microaggression being the person who always has to do the educating. So like you, I'm Asian and lived in places across the country where I was asked not the where are you from, but the more, I think, offensive, what are you question. What are you? And on some days I was more gracious and generous and I educated, especially if it was a child. But on other days, I just, it was not my job today and I'm tired. And everybody has been in this situation before, women and, in different environments. And so I guess the big microaggression, it's sort of oxymoronic, right? A big microaggression is that you're put in the position, we are often put in the position of having to educate when people should be doing their work on themselves. Yeah. But how do you do that? How do you go about doing that? Because you don't have any frame of reference. You don't even know it's a microaggression, right?
Yeah. Well, and this is why like learning opportunities and like books and articles and things like that are so helpful, right? Because ultimately, here's what I find is that, oftentimes you're right. When we're in community and relationships, it's often the people in marginalized groups who are expected to do the education and the intervention and stuff like that. But the reality is, marginalized communities have been talking about their experiences for decades, right? I could literally Google like microaggressions for multiracial people and a bunch will come up. Right? So for me, it's that idea of when we say we're committed to inclusivity and diversity, like it's not just an attitudinal thing. It's also like, how do I lessen the burden of doing the advocacy and education on marginalized communities, which is why I often, again, though I will ask folks, it's often in response to something that I'm studying that I'm not understanding fully, right? Which is a different question. When I ask like transgender and non-binary folks about that pronoun question, like I'm making it clear I'm doing my homework and I still haven't quite figured it out. And for me, like I'm hoping that we can be in community and relationship and learn and grow together.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Robin.
Oh, hi, Kimberly. Well, I just wanted to jump back to that statute of limitations on microaggressions. And what does this, I would just say that I think I think back to like 30 years ago,
Mhm.
I was with some friends, all white friends, and they were doing Chinese accents and, you know, making fun of some of the girls who had just moved from Taiwan. And I got really upset. And my very best friend found me in the bathroom crying. And she said, it's okay, Robin. She's like, everyone thinks you're white. It's okay. And like, and she gave me this big hug. And honestly, it's been like 30 years. And if she came back to me and said, I really regret saying that to you in that moment, like it would actually feel really good.
Oh yeah.
And so I just think that like, I think that, I don't know, like I think especially when you're a kid, these things can really stay with you for a long time. And I think if it's, I think if you're someone who feels like you wronged someone, it's actually always okay to say, hey, I don't even know if you remember this, but I remember this and I feel bad about it.
Yes.
You know?
I'm a big fan of the pre-apology or the post-apology. Because ultimately it's that here's what I find is that when folks have like a change of heart, mind, awareness, whatever, I gotta tell you, there are things that I regret in the past that I wish I could do all over again. And every single time it comes up, I feel like remorseful, right? It's a burden that I'm carrying around. I don't know if it's a burden they're carrying around or not, but I have done the like, you know, in that respect, there is no statute of limitations, right? I have done things like, you know, a couple of years ago, we had this conversation. I felt like I really bombed it, right? Or like even at the end of a day, I'll replay a moment and I go, why did I do that? That was actually not okay. Or that could have come across this way. And when I have that moment, I'll actually go find the person and say, can I just apologize for something that happened yesterday? And what I love about that, and folks have like pushed me on that one too. They're like, what if nobody was offended? And then you say something and they realize they could have been offended and now they're offended. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of ifs. In my posts, way after posts and pre-apologies, never, ever, ever has anyone ever said, well, now that you say something, I am offended. Like that's never happened. Usually I get two classic responses. One, which is, I don't know what you're talking about, but thank you. Right. And the second classic response I get is, I'm glad you said something because that did bother me and I didn't know how I was going to bring it up to you. So I'm sort of saving them a little grief just by acknowledging it. And you're right, for that person who it did impact, it does feel good for somebody to like own it, right?
Monica, please, has a question.
It's actually my husband, Paul.
Okay.
I just really appreciate you making this happen and the fact that we get to have this conversation. So I wanted to say thank you. And also, are there spaces where conversations like this happen on a regular basis in the Puget Sound area? Because I'd really like to participate in that. We just moved here. Yeah, I'm really curious to know about more spaces like this so that I can.
Yeah. And so, you know, ultimately, like I tend to be connected mostly on social media, and then I tend to like attend a lot of workshops and like be like in conversation spaces. But it's also about communities deciding that we need to have conversations like this and hosting, right? And so I love this idea of this workshop, maybe the springboard and the birthplace for some community conversations, because ultimately, like I said, I've worked with thousands of people and I've maybe met 5 bigots, right? Most everyone's like just stumbling around trying to do the right thing and not always having like the most effective
It's 8 o'clock.
So yeah.
Thank you.
So this session is called Navigating Microaggressions, not like worrying about microaggressions. So I want to make sure that I give you some like springboards of tools. Is that okay? I'm sure there are more questions and we can talk forever, but I invite you to think about this maybe as a beginnings of conversations rather than the end, right? Okay. So when folks are like, okay, so I understand that microaggressions are problematic and I do want to intervene. I'm going to share with you 3 tools. The first one, which is speaking from the heart. And this is a tool I tend to use more on one-on-one, but I tend to use this tool when I feel like I can lean on the relationship. Maybe I'm friends with that person, maybe I'm colleagues with them, I'm neighbors with them. And it's interesting because a lot of folks are like, well, I worry that it's going to damage the relationship. So I worry about like intervening when I have a relationship. But everything in the research says that when the intervention comes from somebody you know, and especially somebody you have a relationship with, it's actually much more effective than coming from a stranger. So one, it's scarier, and two, you're going to be more effective. So keep that in mind. Like it's this like double-edged sword, right? There are times when I use this tool because I feel like I can make it personal, right? Whether it is I know something about that person, so I can maybe make a parallel and help them like empathize and understand. Or maybe I have a personal story that maybe will help them sort of understand. And then I definitely use this tool when the relationship is hierarchical. I tend to take this approach when I need to like talk to my supervisor. And I encourage my students to, if they need to call me out on something, like I invite you to use this approach. Um, and the approach is called being a dear, ADEAR. And for me, it involves like affirming the person or the relationship, because no matter how nicely I say it and respectfully I say it, usually the first place people go to is, do you think I'm a bad person, or do you not like me anymore? So I do want to, in that conversation, affirm that this is about words and actions and not about the overall sort of like personhood or the relationship. The D is I try to describe the behavior without judgment, and the without judgment part is both really important and really difficult. The E is to explain the impact, the emotion, the filters, etc. The A is assume positive intent. For me, the first time conversation, I have to give the person the benefit of the doubt. And then the R is request or suggest something different, right? And I think about things like timing. I have yet to have this conversation go well when it's in like a crowded place, or like there are people who are able to overhear the conversation. Folks feel like they're on stage, and they're much more likely to become defensive. I use a lot of I statements because I know what I heard. I know how it makes me feel. I know what I want. Use statements like, you said this, you made me feel this way, you should, is actually in conflict research called pushing behavior. It escalates conflicts rather than de-escalates it. And then I try to describe actions rather than use adjectives. Here's what I mean by that. I could say, for the same situation, there were 4 people in line, 3 men and then me. To the 3 men, you said this. To me, you said this other thing instead. Or I could say, it was really sexist when. Actions, not adjectives, folks. They tend to go over a lot better. And then I like to talk about my inside feelings and not my outside feelings, because oftentimes, even when I'm witness to a microaggression that's actually not even about me, but about somebody else, the emotion is actually pretty it's a vulnerable one. I feel sad, I feel disappointed, I feel betrayed, I feel hurt, like those are the kind of feelings I feel. But a US mainstream society, again, because it doesn't like us to be vulnerable, trains us to go immediately into outside, secondary, or invulnerable emotions, like I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm pissed off. Okay. And I want you to feel the difference between my approaching you saying, I'm really sad about something that happened earlier. Can I talk to you about it? Versus, I'm really pissed off about something that happened earlier. Can I talk to you about it? Because the first one makes you go, what happened? And the second one makes you go, I have to go, right? I'm just saying, right? And so this is like a young person version. So I'm a leader of the Asian Pacific Islander Affinity Group, and we were talking about the model minority myth and how there are these presumptions that Asians are automatically good at math and science. And a student of mine talked about how a good friend actually makes jokes about that all the time, and it does bother her. So this is the conversation that we practice together. So like, you're a good friend and I have so much fun with you and I feel like I can tell you anything. Affirm the person or the relationship, right? Earlier today when I got my math test back and I got a 98, you said, of course you got a 98, you're Asian, right? Words and actions without judgment. I was pretty hurt when I heard that, because I work hard in all my classes, but so many people think that that's somehow easy for me because I'm Asian. And it's sad and it's frustrating that I don't get to own my hard work and accomplishments like everyone else. Explain the impact, the filters, the emotions. Now, I know you don't want me to feel that way. Assume positive intention. Can I ask that you don't say things like that anymore, where my good grades have anything to do with my being Asian? Like, request or suggest something different, right? This goes over a lot differently than for her to say, overachieving Asian Americans, especially in the math and sciences, is a racist microaggression and you need to stop. I'm thinking, right? But at the same time, you don't do this all the time. Like for me, her goal was like, I want the behavior to stop, but I don't want to lose this relationship. So for me, I think about it in a couple of ways. One, this is an investment tool because you don't do this for everybody, but for folks you're like, they have proven themselves to me in many other ways. I want to invest in this person. And I also think about this as like an audition process for figuring out who are my 1.0 people and 2.0 people, because I've had conversations like this and the person responded with, I think you're being too sensitive and you're blowing things out of proportion. In which case I'm like, okay, this is a 1.0 person. Like I'll be friendly with you, I'll be collegial with you, I'll be in, work groups with you, but I don't need to invest in a level of like deep commitment, vulnerability, or authenticity. I don't, right? But I've also had folks respond with, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I won't make jokes like that anymore. In which case I'm like, okay, this is a 2.0 person, somebody who cares about me and cares about what the impact they're having on me is and is willing to learn and grow and change. In which case, even when they mess up, it doesn't impact me the same way because I know I can have this kind of conversation with them and they don't have like hostile intentions, right? So I don't do this with strangers. I don't do this with people I have a sneaking suspicion that they do mean it in that like sort of hostile put down kind of way. I certainly don't do it with guys who like catcall me outside the car window. I'm not like, when you talk about my body, I feel, right? Like it's just colorful hand gestures and I'll move on, right? And then it's interesting because I had an adult, actually a woman who was working in the financial sector, and she was one of the few women in the office, and she's like, I don't have this kind of relationship. Like, I'm not friends with my colleagues, but I definitely but I have to see them every day and I have to work with them every day. And I would like some certain behaviors to stop. So the conversation I coached her with was this. I think you and I both agree we have a right to be respected and heard in this community. So if you can't affirm the person or the relationship, at least affirm the rights that everyone has in a community. When we were disagreeing about budgets, you said you're being over dramatic, and later on, you called me a drama queen. Okay, words and actions without judgments. Like statements like this make it seem like I'm being too emotional or that my concerns are drama rather than real issues. I personally would have added, like, and it's unfair often when men are passionate, they are seen as charismatic, but when women are passionate, they're seen as hysterical or dramatic. But she didn't necessarily feel like she was ready to like bring that gender aspect into it. So it's her conversation. And I'm assuming you don't intend to police my tone or dismiss my concerns. So I would appreciate you not saying things like this anymore. If you have a concern about what I'm bringing up, or if you're disagreeing with me, please disagree with me, but don't use words like over dramatic and drama queen, right? So you can still have a dear conversation, even if it's not that level of relationship. Okay. Now, there are times when it's not a one-on-one conversation. Like maybe you don't know the person that well, maybe it's not your issue, or maybe like there are other people around and it's not the kind of a person or situation where you can pull them aside, in which case I think we still need to say something. And then for me, I tend to use this tool when, and questions I ask myself are like, am I talking to the agent, the person who said it or did it, or am I talking to the audience? Because frankly, like there are times when, especially if somebody is like, I can tell that they mean what they're saying or they intend what they're saying, in which case I'm more interested in talking to the audience. Like I had a colleague who we consistently disagreed on whether something was okay or not. And I gave up on like trying to convince him. But whenever we were in mixed company and he would say it, I would always say, I know we've talked about this before, and I know I'm not going to convince you, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody else didn't think that was the only opinion in the room, in which case I am talking to the audience, right? Sometimes somebody who is within that target group is actually in the room, and I want to minimize the harm to the target group. I have to say something because that silence is actually collusion. There are times when I intervene to educate, and there are times when I intervene to challenge social norms. Dolly Chug, who wrote The Person You Mean to Be, really, she cited some research that was fascinating. Like people don't, like if people feel like in a given context, setting, or community, laughing at racist jokes is okay. They will laugh at racist jokes. If they feel like in a given context, community, and situation, it's okay, it's not okay, they won't, right? So for me, sometimes it's not about like educating, it's about challenging social norms. It's the difference between, hey, when you tell jokes like that, it makes it seem like people from this group are, that's an educational approach. A challenging social norms approach is like those kind of jokes are actually not okay around here, which is actually about challenging social norms. Okay. um, and U.S. mainstream culture, I makes it seem like the best intervention is like that one-liner, the zinger, the call somebody out, humiliate them, put them in their place so that they'll never do it again. And I gotta tell you, that used to be my approach, and it was like interesting for me. But what I found was that people stopped the behavior in front of me, but there wasn't actually a change in perspective. So I was trained with National Coalition Building Institute, and our approach tends to be like reduce the defensiveness through things like tone and body language, and communicate person to person respect. And how do I keep the conversation going? By hearing people out, asking open ended questions. If I can, I try to set aside my feelings for the moment and I dialogue. These days, I step in thinking I'd like to build the relationship or at least not engage in open conflict. I'd like to stop the behavior. And if I can, I'd like to actually win over an ally, somebody who is an aha and is not only willing to change behaviors, but also pay forward that learning and perspective. No acronym this time. There are lots of different approaches you can take. My favorite approach is actually just to ask open-ended questions. Because honestly, when people say something, I don't actually know where they're coming from. And the open ended question actually helps me discern. Because when somebody's like, he looks suspicious, I'm like, well, how did he look? How was he acting? Why was that suspicious? Right? Because in their answer, it tells me what kind of conversation this is going to become. Because I've had folks say, he was wearing a turban. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm going to stop you right there. Right. And that's one kind of conversation. And then I've also had somebody say, well, he kept on walking down the hall and poking his head in one room, and he looked around and he walked down the hall, poked his head into the other room and looked around. He kept on doing that all the way down the hall. I mean, it was really suspicious. And I'm like, I gotta tell you, I do that when I'm lost. Like, I'm trying to figure out why when I do that, people ask, can I help you find something? But when somebody else does that, the police gets called on them, right? But that's like the open-ended conversation helps me determine what kind of conversation this needs to turn into. There are times when I try to find out the experience that's motivating the comment, especially if it's like emotionally charged. Because honestly, when people say things in the heat of emotion, usually there's some sort of emotional truth. And instead of listening and empathizing around that emotional truth, we correct how they chose to express that emotion. And I think about people who are like emotionally full, like walking around with like full buckets, right? And if I try to do any kind of education and intervention, it's just gonna like spill over and make a mess. I want to give that person an opportunity to empty their bucket a little bit so that I can put some stuff in, right? So when somebody's like, oh, why can't they just speak English around here? 90% of the time is coming from a place of, I'm having a hard time communicating, or communication is very frustrating right now, or I feel left out. Like those are actually the emotional truth behind it. And so I like to, connect with them. Like it must be hard not to understand what's going on, and let them talk about it before I say something. Like, English isn't my first language. So while I was learning English, it was so difficult. Like I was always looking for the right words, wondering if I was pronouncing it right, or wondering if what I was saying was making sense. So when I ran into a fellow Korean person, I loved it because communication just flowed and it was so easy, and I could have a personality and I could tell jokes and all those kind of things. So I just really enjoyed talking Korean whenever I encountered another Korean person. So I just find that a lot of folks, they don't speak English because it's just so nice to be able to speak mother tongue every once in a while, right? But I'm not going to go there first, right? If somebody's like, I'm sick of my taxes paying for freeloaders, they're usually talking about financial stress, right? So I'm like, what's going on? So that they can talk about that financial stress. And then I might say something like, Actually, I don't know if you know this. I married somebody who had a stroke when he was 26, and he had to go on unemployment and like massive medical aid to go into speech and physical therapy just so he can learn to like walk and talk and like think again. And thankfully, he was able to regain a lot of his abilities and was able to re-enter the workforce. Now he like makes a good living, is a productive member of society, contributes, pays his taxes, all that stuff, right? And I'm sure that there are people who take advantage of systems, but those systems are so important for folks like my spouse, who without it, I think would have fallen through the cracks and ended up being a bigger drain on society. But I'm not going to go there first, right? And sometimes I'll use exaggerated humor, but you got to be careful about that because a lot of folks see that humor as like sarcasm or judgment, and they feel sort of like put off by it. So I tend to use it very sparingly with people who know that I like using humor, right? And so like I still think it's very funny when one person is asked to represent an entire group, right? Like folks would be like, "You're Asian. What do Asian people think about this?" I'm like, "I don't know. I will go ask." There's like a few billion of us, so I think it might be a while. Like I think I'm being funny, but I've had folks be like, "Well, you don't have to be so sarcastic." So I tend to do it for things I feel like we should know better than that as a society. Some of my students are like, "That movie was so gay." I'm like, "Wait, that movie was attracted to other movies? How could you tell?" Right? Usually when they're like rolling their eyes and laughing, I know I made my point. And then I like to join the other person and not make myself superior. Here's what I mean. Sometimes when we intervene, this is what we look and sound like. We're like, "I can't believe you would say that. I would never say that." Okay. And when that's the attitude, a lot of folks don't want to listen. And if anything, they're going to dig their heels in. Right. And so joining the person doesn't mean you agree with them, but it's actually you're putting yourself at the same level as that person. So when somebody's like, "She got that award because she's Black and female," I'm like, I hear that a lot. And I'm always trying to figure out why is it that when a Black woman achieves something, folks keep on bringing up diversity or affirmative action instead of, she genuinely deserved it, right? Because that's a conversation about what's in our cultural waters, that you think that and I hear that, versus what is wrong with you that you would say that and what is right with me that I wouldn't say that. Okay. And the third piece is this. There are going to be times when we mess up. And when somebody like points it out to us, how can we be gracious in receiving that interventions and listen to the real message? And when somebody calls me out on something that I said or did, I often try to make sure that it's guilt I'm feeling and not shame. Because it turns out guilt and shame are two different emotions. This is Brene Brown's work. Guilt is I did something bad. And it's actually a productive emotion because you're like, "Oh, I feel awful and I did something bad and I never want to feel this again. So I'm going to do something different." Like it motivates you to change behavior right away. But shame is I am bad. And we don't know what to do with shame. Okay. And because a lot of us weren't taught shame resilience, we tend to respond to shame in one of three classic ways. One which is to move away, one which is to move towards, and one which is to move against. And this is what it looks like. Maybe you called me out on something and shame got triggered. Moving away looks like this. I don't talk to you anymore. I walk away. Every single time I see you, I'm reminded of this thing that I did and how you called me out on it and how I felt shame. And I don't want to feel that again. So I see you coming down the street and I make a beeline in the other direction. I ghost you. I disappear from the relationship. Okay. The second way we respond to shame is to move towards. So let's say you called me out on something, and now my goal becomes about you changing your mind or you forgiving me or you taking care of me instead of me changing my behaviors. Right. So I say things like, "Oh, no, I think if you really understood where I was coming from, you would realize that wasn't offensive. Or that couldn't have been anti Semitic. Look at all my Jewish friends on Facebook." Or, it also shows up as like self flagellation. I'm like, "Oh, that was you must think I'm such a bad person. Like, do you hate me?" So that it kind of forces the other person to be like, "No, it wasn't that bad." Right. Which is tough because they had to work their guts up to tell you. And now they have to emotionally take care of you too. Right. And then the third way we respond to shame is to fight shame with shame. So I say something and you call me out on it and shame gets triggered and now I'm out to get you. Right. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, well, you say this other thing all the time and that's just as problematic." Right. I say things like, "Why are you so sensitive?" Or like, "Do you have to make everything about race?" Or I say things like, "Oh, here comes the PC police." Or I say things like, "Oh, aren't you a special snowflake? Like all of those things are actually designed to make you feel bad for saying something in the first place, right? And actually none of those things reduce shame. All like what reduces shame is empathy, connection, and relationship. So for me, it's really important that I pay attention to my mindset voice, because if it's like saying things like you're a terrible person or this person hates you or those kind of things, very fixed mindset things, I'm not going to respond well. And it's probably a shame place I'm in. But if my mindset voice is more growth oriented, like this is so hard and it also might be an opportunity for me to learn and grow, then I can actually like be productive in that space. Okay. And so when folks have called me out on stuff, I have said things like I try to like listen with full attention, and I try not to defend or respond right away, because typically my primary responses are shame responses, and the limbic system is triggered. Like it's the brain area that helps you like fight or flee or freeze, but it doesn't help you actually like engage in conversation. So I try to do things like take slow, deep breaths or acknowledge my feelings, because those two things have been shown in the research to de-escalate the limbic system and start to activate the cortex. I try to remember it's not this mistake that defines who I am. It's actually what I do after I discover this mistake that's actually going to define whether I'm a good person or not. And then I try to prioritize, and I'm trying to be worthy of that person's trust and gift. Because honestly, they could have walked away having written me off as a bigot, but instead they chose to talk to me. That means they believe in that I didn't really mean it, or that I have the capacity to change, in which case I want to be worthy of that trust and gift. And I try to prioritize the impact over intent and apologize for real. And this is not an apology. I'm sorry you took it that way, because that's actually an accusation and not an apology. So I'm usually like, don't bother, right? And for me, like being able to make mistakes, learn from them, and like still maintain relationship is like a crucial form of shame resilience in a 21st century world, right? So I've said things like, I really appreciate you telling me this, or I am so embarrassed that I did that, or, you know, I meant to be funny, but not only was it not funny, it really offended you. I'm so sorry about that, right? There are times when I can tell I'm shame spiraling and I'm not going to handle the situation well. So I'm like, would you mind if I took a few minutes? Because I'm a little sort of overwhelmed, but I want this conversation to go well so bad. Okay. And so I'll take a few minutes and then come back. But you got to come back. Like you can't be like, I'll be back in 5 and like leave the state. Don't do that. And then there are times when I thought I could handle it, and then I got all shame spirally and defensive and explaining. And it's only afterwards when I've calmed down and the limbic system has like quieted that I go, why did I respond that way? I could have handled that so much better. And when I have that realization, I'll usually go back to the person, right? You tried to tell me something yesterday and I didn't handle it well. And I just want you to know I thought about it afterwards and you're right. And I'm going to work on that. And I'm sorry I responded so poorly in the moment, because I don't want them to think that my poor reaction in the moment was the punchline of all of their efforts. I want them to continue to invest in me. Okay. So like, let me ask you a question. Given the time, do you want to go into breakout groups and chat, or do you want to do Q&A? Give me 1 if you want to go into breakouts, and then 2 if you want to be in all group Q&A. Just in the chat, write 1 or 2, please. Okay. I think a pattern is emerging. Okay. All right. So I'm sorry, like I'm gonna be in Q&A mode just so that we can respond to the needs of a lot of the folks. But I hope that you know, Parent Edge can, or it can set up another conversation, because we could talk about this for a long time. So questions, thoughts, worries.
Sorry, I have a question for you. So for me as a parent, that I see some of these microaggressions on my kids, and I see the emotional toll that it takes on them and how they shift. What can I do, not as a parent, to support them emotionally? And if you have any resources to to help them along. I have one that is younger, so these tools might be okay, but a little more on the shy side, so I'm not sure. And I have an older one that switched his name to be more English sounded, so people will not keep asking, where's he from? So yeah, that's my question.
And I'm going to channel the work of Howard Stevenson, who wrote Racial Literacy in Schools and actually does a lot of work around healing from racial trauma. But he talks about like affection, correction, protection, right? Which is like, I think about, for example, like, I think about my nephew when he got made fun of, like kids he didn't know were like doing this and saying ching chong, and he was pretty upset about that. And the affection, like here's what affection, correction, protection sounds like, right? Which is, I just want you to know you are beautiful. Our language is beautiful. You are awesome, and I love you so much, right? Affection, correction. What they did was not okay. It's not okay to make fun of somebody for how they look. It's not okay to make fun of somebody for their culture. Okay, that's what those kids did was not okay. And a protection is the next time something like that happens, just so you know, you can say things like, that's not what my eyes look like, and that's not what my language sounds like, or walk away. You can like go find an adult and say, this is happening and this is not okay. But just know you don't have to stand there and take it, right? So especially for like I mean, for me, I often talk to the kids about like, as a teacher, this is something that I say a lot is, I wasn't born Rosetta. I was born in Korea. My name is Eunyoung Lee, right? Lee Eunyoung, right? And I love my name. It has family meaning and it has personal significance to me. And when I came to the United States, people kept on saying, your name is so hard to pronounce. Your name is so hard to pronounce. And all I wanted to do was like fit in and belong and be liked. And so I said, okay, while you're learning how to pronounce my name, you can call me Rosetta. Here's a nickname. And at that point, everybody stopped trying and I became Rosetta, to the point where by the time I was 19 and I got my citizenship and I could choose my legal name, I realized literally my immediate family is the only ones who know me as Eunyoung Lee. And so for the sake of convenience, not because that's how I identify, I am now Rosetta Eunyoung Lee. And I wish I could go back to my younger self and go, you can pronounce my name. You can learn to pronounce my name. If you practice, you can get it. If I can, speak Korean and then come to the United States and learn how to pronounce like English words, and then so that I can keep up with like, culture and education, I can say things like Tchaikovsky and Schwarzenegger and supercalifragilisticexpialidocious or generis. Like you can say Eunyoung. Right? I wish I could do that, because in retrospect, like I feel sad that people don't know this such important part of me, and I don't want you to feel that regret, right? So I know that you're making the choices you feel like you need to, and I hope that you'll remember that your name is beautiful. I love you. It has meaning and significance for us and our culture, and how this is the name that I chose for you because it has that kind of meaning. And it's not okay for people to sort of like look for simpler ways for their convenience rather than supporting your identity. And you have some choices. You can say, like, you can, say, this is how you pronounce it. You can say, like, I'm not going to take a nickname, or you can take a nickname temporarily, but then continue to press on. Like, you have lots of choices, but I just want you to remember that you get to be who you are and honor the name that you want to be, not what others find convenient. Other thoughts, questions?
I have a question, I guess, for I guess for parents of kids of color. Mm-hmm. And your previous question kind of spoke to it a little bit, but I'm imagining that for many of us parents, I think there's a lot that we may have internalized as kids growing up in a different culture, without us knowing it. And so as adults, like, we're here because we don't want that for our kids, right? So I guess my question is, what are your tips, or I don't know, what is your advice for how you would parent your kid, and maybe specifically an Asian kid, to not internalize their experience? Like for me, I figured out, like, in my 20s that I had done this, and that I needed to do a lot of work to undo it. And it took a long time. So I guess as I try to talk with my kids, I'm finding that I don't know. I feel like because the Asian place in our country is a little unique, I guess, we can go between sometimes being in a place of privilege and being in a place of not. And so I find that it's hard to find resources for my kids to, like, talk about this and give them, I don't know, like, I don't know. I just don't know. I know I can talk about my experience, but I'm hoping that their experience is not going to be my experience. So I guess
and I think it's also I think about, how old are your kids, by the way?
3rd and 4th grade.
3rd and 4th grade. Okay, so they're still in conversation and they still listen to you, which is great. And so, like, with middle schoolers and high schoolers, it's not always the case. But, like, you know, ultimately, I think about the idea of, especially for younger kids, they think you're born fully formed out of the womb as you are, right? So you having, like, unpacked and overcome a lot of internalized stuff and still continuing your journey is actually a really important thing for them to know. Like, I actually purposely show my middle school kids, like, photos of me in, like, high school when I was deep in assimilation phase, right? It was like the late 80s, early 90s. So I had, like, the big perm with the bangs going up and the bangs going down. Like, I, like, did the eyeshadow double eyelid when my people just don't have that, right? Fuzzy Angora sweater, you name it. And the kids are like, what is that? I'm like, that is me when I thought I had to do this to belong, right? And they're like, that does not look like you. I'm like, it wasn't me, right? And honestly, I think there is a whole group of people who think they were friends with me, but they were friends with a fake version of me, a pretend me. And I think the real me is so much cooler. And I think they missed out. And, you know, like, those kind of things are important for young people to know, that we too have our own journeys, right? And use that as a springboard for conversation. So if anything happens where you feel like, you know, you want to hide the fact that you're Asian, or you don't like talking about being Asian because you're worried that it's gonna be like somebody's making fun of, or like, you don't, you know, like, I think about so many kids who are just like don't speak the home language when you drop me off, or like, you know, like, I don't pack that for lunch for me, like, and those kind of things. Like, to me, like, that's them starting to internalize this notion of being who I am is not acceptable. And there's a big difference between, like, I think about parenting research that talks about protective socialization, which is like helping them navigate a world that doesn't always see them, right? And so, like, I think about, what is that message where you're like, in a fair and kind and just world, right? You would be seen for the full, beautiful, wonderful, cultured, like, our way of being would be an addition to the beauty of a culture and society. Sadly, there are many who don't know that, or think that somehow, like, other ways of being are better. And you know, I think about this notion of, it's unfortunate, but it does happen. But these are some ways that you can negotiate. And there are people who are eager to connect with you on your own terms and as who you are. And part of your job is to figure out who are your 1.0 people and 2.0 people. Like, that kind of language you might want to incorporate later. But it's that idea of, like, helping them understand, like, the real friends actually don't make you change. The real friends actually like you for who you are. And those kind of coaching conversations early and often, because you're right. In a blink of an eye, they can absorb all of the societal messages and operate in ways that they're walking around like they somehow need to earn their belonging instead of they deserve belonging.
Rosetta, someone asked if you could share the author/tool, and I think it was affection.
Howard Stevenson.
Howard Stevenson.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a chance, maybe put that in the chat.
Yeah.
And then there's another question here. Do you have any advice about how to foster community buy-in to becoming better, namely finding a starting point to becoming a more welcoming community?
Yeah, I think about this notion of it's a multifaceted approach, right? And so I think about how, like, for example, when I think about schools, it's not just like trying to increase the demographic diversity. It's also about like what's in the curriculum, what does the representation look like, what are the ways that you create like opportunities for folks to tell stories, like talk about heritage, culture, identity, and build like a relationship and community across those. It's also about like what are those many schools have like affinity groups, right? And so people who share identity, who come together to talk about what it's like to navigate the world and build like tools and strategies for navigating the world that doesn't always affirm them. And then it's also about like, the reality is, I think there are folks who are deeply committed to inclusivity and see diversity as value added. And there are always some folks who see diversity as a problem to be managed. And so for me, it's about how do you amplify the skills and the joy of the community that is committed toward inclusivity. And like Parker Palmer talks about how movements happen. First, individuals operate within a system and they're like, this isn't right. Right. And then they start to find other individuals who feel similarly and they start to like connect and like affirm ideas and solidify like what's going on for them and things like that. And once that community grows large enough, like they're like like we're not going to reward the system with the same sort of like our sort of participation in the same system, and we're going to demand something else. And as soon as you get a critical mass, the system can't operate without people, right? So I often think about communities are like that. Like, how do you get these like enthused core communities like that connect like meaningfully and have real conversations? And it not only do you not like explode, there's actually like joy and connection and community that gets built in spaces like this. I often think about this idea of community work is like, the party bus. And I'm like, you're always welcome on the party bus, but the bus is the bus is moving, right? So I wouldn't necessarily wait for an entire like community. I would say start those grassroots movements and grow it.
Oh, Rosetta, you've really put in a long evening and we appreciate it so much. I think it's about time to wrap up. We will save the chat in case we didn't get to everything. Yeah, and I think I'll turn it over to Michelle in case she has anything last minute to say.
No, just thank you all again for coming and taking time out of your evening to join us. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this topic, and we will continue to think about different ways to have this conversation, whether in small groups or in a larger community setting. And I think we're all ready to do the work. So thank you. And thank you, Rosetta, for your approachability, your examples, and just really helping us feel hope in that we can affect change. So thank you all.
Thank you.
And I will be sending out the links and recording in the next couple of days. So thank you all. Have a great evening.
Good night, everybody.